Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I see some familiar faces today and some new ones. For those of you who don't know, I am Hannah Shea with World Law Group, and I work with our practice and industry groups. One of them being our corporate transactions group, which is hosting today's session with our guest speakers from Brunswick. We are muting you as you have joined the meeting, just so that we don't get interference while we're speaking. But feel free to ask any questions in the chat. You can just drop them into the chat, and Andrew and I will be monitoring those. We are recording the session and we will post it on our website. It'll be behind the login next week. And you'll see the little otter AI that has joined. That is our recording and note-taking service. So don't be alarmed by that. You are not actually being live streamed, any of you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Andrew Ang, who is the co-chair for the Asia region for the Corporate Transactions Group with World Law Group. Andrew.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you may be. My name is Andrew Ang, and thank you for taking the time to join us at this World Law Group Corporate Transactions Group meeting. Now, after what most might claim to be a terrible year for M&A activity in 2023, during which we saw a 25% decline in global M&A value, I'm certain most of you are now hoping that M&A activity will revive in 2024, but challenges clearly remain. Today, we have the pleasure of having the team from Brunswick to share with us what they are seeing in terms of some of these challenges, be it increased regulatory scrutiny or shareholder activism, and how they advise clients to navigate these challenges through communication. As you may be aware, Brunswick is a strategic advisory firm focused on critical issues and critical stakeholders. Before we begin, let me do a very quick introduction of our panel of speakers today. First, we have Sunita Chalam, partner, head of office in Singapore. Sunita advises multinational and Asian companies how to tell their stories to and engage effectively with a range of stakeholders, including media, investors, government, and employees, both proactively to build trust and goodwill, and reactively to manage issues such as climate and sustainability, supply chain and labor, data and cybersecurity. She also leads Brunswick's crisis and cybersecurity practice in Asia. Prior to joining Brunswick, Sunita was in the Singapore Foreign Service for 11 years, where she handled bilateral relations with Indonesia and France, and represented Singapore in global climate change negotiations. Next, we have Stuart Hudson, partner and co-head of regulatory practice in London, specializing in mergers and acquisitions, regulation, and public policy. From 2019 to 2023, Stuart served at the UK Competition and Markets Authority as Senior Director of Strategy, a member of the Executive Committee, and an advisor to the board. In his previous time at Brunswick from 2010 to 2019, he advised clients across Europe, North America, and Asia on a range of transactions and regulatory issues. During the global financial crisis, he was appointed a special advisor to Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and prior to that, he was head of government affairs at the energy regulator Ofgem. Over the years, he has held policy and strategy roles in national and local election and referendum campaigns. Stuart's UK M&A experience includes advising companies, ministers, and regulators on many of the highest profile transactions of the past 15 years. And the list is impressive. I mean, it includes the Kraft Cadbury takeover, Pfizer's battle for AstraZeneca, SoftBank acquisitions of ARM, Melrose and GKN, the block merger of Sainsbury's and Asda, and for all you gamers out there, the largest video game acquisition, that of Activision by Microsoft. Now, last but not least, we have Charlie Coons, the Brunswick's partner in New York. Charlie has more than 24 years experience as a trusted advisor in M&A and in proxy contests to both corporate issuers as well as shareholders. He has broad experience in advising executive teams and boards of directors on how best to deal with activist issues. Charlie was most recently Managing Director of the Activism and Contested Situations Advisory Group at Morrow Sodali, advising clients on shareholder activism and mergers and acquisitions. Before that, he was a Managing Director of Shareholder Activism at Mackenzie Partners, where he advised clients in some of the largest Wall Street proxy contests and hostile M&A situations. Okay, enough of my voice. Let me start the session proper by handing the time over to you, Sunita.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for having us, and good evening, everyone from Singapore, and good morning, good afternoon for anyone who's around the world. Andrew has started with a quick introduction, and I hope many of you are familiar with Brunswick. But for those of you who aren't, I thought it might be helpful to start with just a very, very brief introduction of who we are and what we do and what our role is in M&A to really provide some context to today's discussion. So Brunswick, as Andrew mentioned, was founded 35 years ago in London as a financial communications firm, specializing very much in M&A. And financial communications is still a very, very big part of what we do, and we're very excited to work on some of the biggest deals globally. But we've really grown over the years to become a full-service advisory firm. So with expertise not just in M&A, but also IPO, shareholder activism, investor engagement, but also competition, antitrust, regulation, public policy, ESG, and so on. And so what we do now is bring all of this to bear in complex situations, and M&As and financial transactions are certainly becoming a lot more complex than they used to be, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. One of the things that sets Brunswick apart is that we have a single P&L globally, which means we're able to bring together teams in different geographies pretty seamlessly on cross-border transactions. And I'm very excited today to have Stuart Hudson, who joins us from our London office, and Charlie Coons, who joins us from New York. And this really is an example of the type of work that we do together. So before I hand it over to Stuart and Charlie, I just wanted to explain a little bit what our role is through the life cycle of an M&A transaction. So I think to kick it off, companies used to focus almost exclusively in the past, I would say, on shareholders, investors, analysts, and the financial media. But in reality, M&A can have a significant impact on a company's communication strategy, which in turn has an impact on things like employee morale, on customer loyalty, in addition to shareholder value. So our focus is really on communicating with the full spectrum of stakeholders in any situation. So this is, customers, business partners, employees, investors, but also government and regulators, sometimes industry bodies, labor unions, media, and so on. And so what we describe this as is taking a bit of a campaign approach to M&A communications. So just to talk you through what this involves, ahead of a transaction, we normally focus on developing a clear and consistent messaging strategy that explains the reasons and rationale for the M&A, what it means for the company and the stakeholders involved, while also addressing specific concerns that stakeholders may have, such as disruption to the industry, job losses, changes in company culture, and so on. We also look, as I said earlier, to identify key stakeholders, so who really matters in this situation, and tailoring communications to them based on their concerns. And, the communications plan should include the timing and the frequency of communication, so what we want to say to them and when, but also what types of channels we use to communicate. So obviously media is one of the channels, but there are many ways of going direct to various stakeholder groups. As many of you would know, we also work on being prepared with a good strategy to handle leaks, which inevitably occur in these situations. During the transaction process, the focus is very much on providing regular updates to stakeholders on key milestones. Particularly, it's really important to be quite upfront about any risks or challenges associated with the deal, such as regulatory hurdles or integration challenges. There may be a need in some instances for shareholder approval if either or both parties are listed, in which case our focus is on garnering voting support through shareholder engagement or engagement with a proxy advisory firm. And this process could be complicated, obviously, if activists threatened a deal, and Charlie will talk about this in more detail later. Similarly, in cases where regulatory approvals are required, a merger review and antitrust team gets involved, particularly in situations where there is additional complexity beyond just competition issues. So a high-profile transaction with significant reputational implications, geopolitical overlay, which is a big issue we are facing now, the involvement of sensitive industries like semiconductors. And again, we'll talk in a bit more detail about this. And then post-deal close, the focus is very much on devising a clear integration plan for the two businesses, which encompasses identifying possible barriers as well as potential areas of conflict, establishing a governance structure, and a communications program to ensure seamless transition. M&A also brings together employees from different cultures and backgrounds, which may pose challenges for communication, collaboration. And effective communication can really help a company address stakeholder challenges, but also cultural challenges that often arise in an M&A. So that said, I'd just sort of like to make a few remarks on the M&A landscape. So as Andrew mentioned, last year was a particularly challenging one for M&A. We saw significant geopolitical uncertainty, armed conflict, a high interest rate environment, and a general economic slowdown, all of which affected the M&A landscape. And coming into 2024, we're sensing some cautious optimism, but the reality is that the environment continues to be quite complicated. Many of you will be aware that a record-breaking number of companies this year are due to hold national elections. Indonesia just held their elections last year, but we've also got India, the UK, and the US, amongst others. And the US-China relationship continues to add additional complexity, particularly when it involves sensitive sectors. The reality, though, with the geopolitics is that this has become, I wouldn't say normal, but it's something that increasingly the world is getting used to. The other big theme that we're seeing is greater scrutiny from both regulators and from investors. And we'd really like to focus on these two themes today. So as far as investors, as far as regulators are concerned, regulatory scrutiny is not just confined to one region, but we're really seeing this across all geographies, from the US to the EU to China. And I would say this is exacerbated to a degree by rapid developments in sectors like AI, which have regulators in some jurisdictions feeling like they might be lagging behind in terms of regulatory action. Similarly, we've seen increased activity from activist investors. According to a Barclays report, nearly half of all activist campaigns in 2023 included an M&A objective. And we're sensing a greater desire to hold companies accountable on issues like climate, ESG, and so on. But some of this is also driven by opportunism, with investors looking to push for higher valuations, particularly in certain sectors. So as I said, we're going to focus on these two themes today, and I'm going to hand it over to Stuart Hudson to cover regulation and antitrust. Stuart.
Thank you very much, Sunita. Now, Andrew and Sunita have both talked about what a bad year last year was for M&A, so I thought I'd spend a little bit on one of the issues that's been blamed for that, which is around the tough environment for antitrust in enforcement in deals. And I thought I'd talk about, so briefly, about I think 4 trends that are really kind of driving this tough environment in antitrust, and 3 things that companies can then do about it. Now, and I think the first thing that we're seeing so behind it is the growth in digital markets. I mean, looking back until a few years ago, merger control in transactions was relatively straightforward. For a start, there weren't all that many countries that even had ex-ante merger regimes. So back in 1990, there were only 3 of them globally: the US and Canada and Germany. Over time, that's grown to now being a situation where you have 150 countries with an ex-ante merger control regime. So when a deal is taking place, there are more filings to be made in more countries. But what makes that sort of particularly complex is then the growth in digital markets, because whereas back in the day when, if you're a company that made and sold products in country A, buying a company that made and sold products in country B, those were the countries where you'd expect to have to get antitrust approval. But with the growth of digital markets and digital services, customers can be located anywhere in the world. And what that has led to has been sort of quite a few occasions where companies have been surprised by which authorities have asserted jurisdiction over transactions. And because these markets are changing so quickly, there's a limited bank of precedents on which companies can draw. So if you look at cases over the past few years, from Illumina Grail to Sabre Fair Logics, where companies have felt that authorities have asserted jurisdiction where there was no sort of significant grounds for them to do so. So that has made it a more complex environment. I think the second thing behind that is a trend towards more aggressive enforcement against mergers, even outside digital markets. And I think across a wide number of authorities over the past, sort of 5-10 years, an increasing sense that there had been a period in which too many mergers had been allowed to go through, and that it was important that the concentration had increased, competition weakened across quite a number of geographic markets, and therefore a feeling amongst authorities that they need to try and rectify that balance. It's come through particularly strongly in the United States over the past few years, under President Biden, where sort of Jonathan Cantor, his antitrust lead at the Department of Justice, sort of said that the era of lax antitrust enforcement is over. But you've also seen in the European Union a tougher approach to vertical mergers. China updated its sort of merger regime last year, and although it kind of reduced the thresholds beyond which notification is mandatory, one of its reasons for doing so was to give it more kind of flexibility to launch discretionary reviews, to call in transactions that might actually be below the thresholds, but where it thinks it needs to take a look at them in order to protect consumers. The third trend is for agencies acting in different and divergent ways. Now, to some extent, this has always been the case. You have the United States that is not able to, where the FTC and the DOJ are not able to block mergers directly. They need to sue in court. But you have the United Kingdom that actually has extremely kind of wide powers now post Brexit to block mergers, and has shown a willingness to do so globally. Andrew mentioned Microsoft Activision at the start, which was an example of that. And authorities can also take different approaches to remedies where they find the competition problems exist. Again, on that example of Microsoft and Activision, which was reviewed by the United States, the European Commission, and the UK Competition and Markets Authority. They all broadly agreed on what the problems were in the cloud gaming market, but they took different views on what was required to address them. And the UK took the toughest view, and so ended up prohibiting that transaction. Although Microsoft subsequently restructured and resubmitted it. So the divergence between authorities again makes it a complex one to manage. The final sort of trend is really the competition, antitrust interacts with other policy agendas as well. Now, Sunita touched on this a bit earlier. If you're kind of looking to get a deal cleared, it's not simply a question of getting competition clearance. Increasingly, there is a tougher set of foreign direct investment and national security clearances that are required in a number of jurisdictions. governments are also looking at how competition interacts with industrial strategy and where they may wish to protect companies that they view as having critical places in their supply chains. And then partly connected with that, in some areas, a greater degree of political intervention, which again can make the decision-making of antitrust authorities harder to predict. So in the face of all of that complexity, what can companies do about it? I think there are three kind of, sort of big lessons, and this is what we see in sort of those bigger global deals. For example, Broadcom, VMware, which were identified over the past year. The first is the need to do your due diligence early on, and that is not simply on the formal legal powers of the authorities involved, but also what's driving their agendas. What's the extent of the political kind of influence that might be placed on them? How might they end up working internationally with other authorities? We find increasingly that clients are coming to us looking for that kind of analysis early on before they go public in a deal. The second lesson is really around international coordination. We will look, particularly in those bigger deals, to ensure that we've got a coordinated team across all of the key jurisdictions working together, so that we can look at how events in, say, China might influence the debate in the United States, or so on, and help again to reduce surprises. And the third lesson is really to anticipate, keep track of, and promote helpful interventions from stakeholders who, in particular customers, but other organizations and broader stakeholders who may take a public position on a deal, and whose approach and view could influence those decision makers. Those are kind of sort of I guess the four trends that we're really seeing at the moment, and three of the kind of tactics that we're really sort of pursuing with clients on behalf of deals, and which I think in a year when we are hoping the news on M&A is getting better, will provide us all with a better chance of being able to bring deals to fruition. I'll leave it there and then hand over to Charlie to talk about sort of another big challenge that clients are facing in M&A.
Great. Thanks, Stuart. I thought I would first provide some brief context in terms of the global shareholder activism front. In terms of global activist campaigns, 2023 concluded the busiest two-year span on record, with a total of 229 campaigns, which was roughly about the same as 2022, which had 235 campaigns. But we did see a significant uptick in the fourth quarter with 71 new campaigns, which was an 11% year-over-year increase. These elevated activist campaign levels occurred despite geopolitical instability, ongoing economic uncertainty, and continued deeply depressed M&A and financing markets. But 49% of overall activist campaigns had an M&A related demand, which was another all-time high. Some different examples included JANA's demand for Frontier Communications to sell itself, ValueAct's campaign for Seven & I to divest 7-Eleven, and Carl Icahn's campaign against Illumina over its acquisition of Grail. While campaigns in the US decreased 20% year over year to 109 total, 2023 was still in line with the 4-year average. Activism in the US accounted for roughly 50% of global activity, and many US-based activists have now looked to different geographies for attractive targets. In other parts of the world outside of the US, Canada saw a 171% increase in campaigns. We saw record activity in Europe with 65 campaigns, which is a 30% increase. The UK had a 71% increase to an all-time high of 29 campaigns. Germany saw a 120% increase to 11 campaigns. Elliott continued to be the leading global activist with 15 total campaigns, including NRG, Phillips 66, Catalan, Crown Castle, and Salesforce as examples. Just as a side note, my colleague Michael O'Looney previously ran communications at Elliott, so he and I both have deep prior experience in working on the other side of the battlefield with activists. Just to clarify, we at Brunswick only work with companies in defending them against activists, but Michael and I have seen it from the other side of the equation. I would say that the more experienced and sophisticated activists will have spent considerable amount of time to understand the key drivers of value at the target company and to then articulate a clear vision of how the company can improve shareholder value, often focusing on several different key themes. These themes could include a focus on operational issues where the activist believes that the business itself is not being properly managed, and as a result, the value of the company's stock does not reflect its true potential. The activist may come with specific thoughts on how the company can be better run by assessing the corporate structure and eliminating excess corporate costs. They can come with capital allocation thoughts where the activist pushes for the company to make changes to its balance sheet. While often dismissed as short-term and focused, some activists will push for the company to return excess cash to shareholders via share repurchases or dividends and achieve a bump in the price of the stock. While not as prevalent in today's higher interest rate environment, a number of activists in the past have pushed for the company to take on more debt and lever up the balance sheet. Then we get into structural issues with M&A. Activists will often go after companies where they see opportunities for value creation by advocating for the sale of a business division or perhaps the entire company. They have often worked to oppose transactions which they believe are not in the best interests of shareholders, either because they believe the company is spending too much on an acquisition or that the company to be acquired is not a good fit strategically. We've seen quite a bit of this in 2023. And then on governance issues, activists will frequently attack what they believe to be shortcomings in the board of directors as an effective overseer of company strategy, or shortcomings of the management team in implementing that strategy. They will often seek to make changes at the board level by removing directors who are long in tenure or whose background and skills are not seen as relevant to the success of the company. They will often come with suggestions for new members of the board that will bring fresh perspectives, sometimes from the activist firm itself and also from third parties. It's worth noting that a number of years ago, there was something of a stigma attached to serving as a director nominee with an activist. And that's really no longer the case. While some may have reservations about being associated with an activist, there's also a very deep and wide pool of talent that activists can draw from when looking to make changes at a company's board. Finally, the activist may seek to make changes to the company's management itself. This is where things often get very contentious, as clearly a CEO will seek to defend their record and will take attacks by the activists personally. It will also test the board's willingness to defend management in a potentially public battle. It's worth noting that most investors will be quite cautious about voting a CEO off the board in the absence of a viable alternative, as they typically see it as far too destabilizing a move. In many instances, going after a high-profile target is part of the activist strategy to elevate their own standing and raise capital for their own fund. While approaches do vary from case to case, many, if not most activists, will first initiate a private dialogue with company management and the board. It's important that companies remember that all of these interactions should be viewed through the lens of how they will be perceived by other shareholders if and when the dialogue with the activist becomes public. They will want to establish a record of objective engagement and that they have treated the activist with the same respect as any other shareholder. If the activist then feels that their voice is not being heard privately, they will often seek to add pressure by leaking their involvement, perhaps sometimes to the media or other shareholders. This can quickly escalate further to making public announcements or filings about their ownership stake in the company and their case for why change is needed. This can involve live television interviews, the release of a detailed white paper, investor presentation, or shareholder letter, leveraging the support of fellow investors or other third parties, the launch of a full-scale digital campaign, including a dedicated campaign website and use of social media, and finally, the actual nomination of alternate directors to be elected by shareholders. Media coverage of shareholder activism has changed materially over the years. Whereas financial media used to treat activists with a great deal of skepticism, there now exists an entire category of activism beat reporters who will gladly break a story about a new activist target. Often these reporters will give the company very short notice and chance for comment on a pending story, so it is key to have a well-prepared media response plan that anticipates a variety of activist scenarios. While the activists will often seek to draw the target into the public arena from the outset, it's important to remember that, like a political campaign, elections are not won on day one, but can very well be lost. Having the discipline to respond rationally rather than emotionally to the bait thrown out by an activist is critical. Companies should maintain the high road and demonstrate that they are the responsible steward of investor capital. Working with a client in the context of a activist shareholder engagement is very much a team sport, consisting of players within the client organization as well as outside advisors. Brunswick works at the heart of this team by virtue of its deep experience in these situations, combined with sector-specific knowledge as well as local and global market insights. We work hand in hand with outside legal, financial, and proxy advisors who often consist of individuals who we know well and have worked well with in the past. While the client will typically want to understand all of the strategic options available to them, it is also important for advisors to stay closely coordinated and come to alignment on tactics and strategy, rather than make the sausage, as it were, in front of the client. Finally, while I don't have a specific case study, time to sort of go through a specific case study, I would say one specific activist situation to watch would be the Starbucks fight right now with which is going against the SOC, or Strategic Organizing Center, which is a labor union group who is campaigning for 3 seats at the Starbucks Board of Directors at the upcoming March 13th annual meeting. This is the first single issue proxy fight since the implementation of the Universal Proxy Card rule in the US. While it bears some similarities to Carl Icahn's campaign at McDonald's in 2022 over animal welfare, their campaign seeking the 3 nominees on the basis of their experience strictly in labor and union relations is quite new. It remains to be seen if the major proxy advisory firms, ISS and Glass Lewis, as well as the largest investors, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, etc., will support any of the SOC director nominees who have limited corporate boardroom experience. It would set a significant precedent for shareholders in the US to elect a labor representative to a corporate board. We'll see what happens March 13th. Back to you.
Thank you, Charlie. Maybe we come to the stage of the session where we look into, the crystal ball, and I'm going to ask some questions in terms of prediction and forecast. I'll start with you, Stuart. What is your view of the regulatory landscape in the next 12 to 18 months? And should we expect to see more divergence between regulatory approaches in the US? I guess that depends on who wins the election, UK, EU, and Asia.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I think you hit the nail on the head in the final part of your question, where you referred to the upcoming US elections, and I think because across a number of different jurisdictions, we may see quite a different approach on antitrust depending on how those elections go. Now, I think the United States is the jurisdiction where that is most likely to be to be the case. I think if President Biden is re-elected, I think we should expect to see a continued robust approach to antitrust enforcement from the authorities. I think if President Trump makes it back in, then I don't think it necessarily means an automatic kind of return to a soft approach to merger control, because actually that did strengthen in some ways under Trump's first term, but certainly a greater degree of unpredictability on foreign direct investment sort of control. I think in the European Union, I think that you would expect to see less immediate significant change after the elections. DG Comp is a little bit more kind of insulated in its day-to-day decision making on mergers from those political influence. But I think what I would expect to see is, and this really gets to the other part of your question, is regulators actually working together a little bit more on sort of on the question of remedies that they could accept in response to competition concerns on mergers. Now, I think that both the US and in particular the EU and the UK in the past couple of years have had situations where they've ended up in very, very different outcomes, and in where that has reflected badly on one or more of the authorities involved. I would expect to see over the next 2 years or so authorities in what's called the International Competition kind of Network and at the OECD and those other international forums where the enforcers gather together a lot, greater discussion to build their learnings of the extent to which behavioural remedies can really kind of sort of remedy concerns in deals, and whether they may be able to change their policy so that some of the divergence that we've seen over the past couple of years may become less prevalent.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to continue to stick with you. I mean, earlier on you talked about the digital markets and AI having come up, on the agenda for antitrust. Now, what are the implications for companies, particularly with the first gatekeepers now appointed under the Europe's Digital Markets Act?
Yes, and I think there are two big things really for companies to be thinking about in respect of AI. So first of all, is what are the different tools that competition authorities could use to address concerns here? So, for example, at the moment, a number of authorities are looking at the partnerships that the so-called, the hyperscalers, sort of Microsoft, Amazon, Google, are using with AI companies such as OpenAI, and what antitrust authorities are looking at is, well, A, is there a problem here? And B, if there is, what tool should I use? Do I try and use my merger control powers here to stop, to look into the relationships that they've got? Do I use my kind of, sort of my antitrust powers to deal with these as potentially kind of, anti-competitive agreements? Or are there kind of other tools that I should look at? So I think, I think we do need to be appreciative of the fact that the authorities could behave in quite different ways there. And then the second aspect is the evolution of ex-ante regulation in digital. You referred to the the DMA in Europe. We're seeing the DMU in the UK. It's being replicated elsewhere, where authorities are taking on those powers to make rules for systemically significant firms. Now, those rules haven't been put in place yet. We will see only over the next kind of year, 2 years, really, how the authorities are going to be using those powers, and the extent to which they use those ex-ante powers or the ex post sort of competition powers to deal with any problems that they see arising.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to come over to you now, Charlie. Earlier on, you mentioned that in 2023, M&A was the main driver of many activist campaigns, including a high number of first-time activists. Now, why was this the case? And do you think this trend is likely to continue in 2024?
Well, I do, for the time being. And I think that the reason why we've seen it be such it's always been a significant portion of activist campaign themes, but I think particularly so in the challenging environment that we've seen around M&A, with so many crosswinds in terms of financing challenges, high interest rates, geopolitical instability. All of these cross currents, we're seeing activists come in saying, well, the company should be sold. Well, the company did a deal and they shouldn't have done that deal, and we're going to fight against it. There are lots of different theses that activists are coming in with, and it's not necessarily we see a quick path to value creation with a quick sale here, but oftentimes they're saying, wait a second, don't do that. That's a really terrible idea right now. So I think that the continued uncertainty in the M&A market will mean that we continue to see M&A as a theme, sort of going both ways in terms of both for and against deals.
Does this mean that that you expect to see additional proxy fights from single issue interest groups?
Well, in terms of this, I think that the Starbucks fight is a really interesting one, and it's, you know, Carl Icahn's McDonald's campaign 2 years ago was kind of unique because it was just around animal welfare, and it was so very, very narrowly defined. But it was the first time you had seen a subject like that where an activist was trying to put someone on the board of directors rather than just put forward a shareholder proposal saying, we're going to seek support of this from shareholders on, on animal welfare, whatever the issue is. I think that it's now been about 18 months since the advent of the universal proxy card rule in the US. And we didn't see a whole lot of immediate change in 2023, but you could argue that the Starbucks fight is sort of a testing of the waters there in terms of them running a campaign on a pretty narrowly focused issue, albeit, employees or partners, as they call them at Starbucks, are a very significant issue for the company. But I think ultimately looking to see if they can win one of those three director nominees. These campaigns from an activist perspective are expensive, especially for a company of Starbucks size and retail shareholder base. You're talking about millions of shareholders. So we'll see. I think we will see some additional sort of single issue contests like that going forward. And I think particularly around labor, which has really been quite top of mind in the US, particularly this past year.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm going to switch gears slightly now, and I'm going to pick you guys your brains on what practical advice and strategies. Now I'll start with you, Sunita. What does the ideal relationship between lawyers and Brunswick look like? Can you talk to us about, you mentioned legal strategies earlier on and their importance when thinking about transactions?
I think in a lot of these situations, we work very closely. So in a financial transaction, we work very closely with both financial and legal advisors. Increasingly, as we've talked about today, a lot of the types of situations we're dealing with are becoming a lot more complex, requiring the involvement of different parties. So we see ourselves very much as a complement to the legal advisors in a situation like this. I think the relationship really works best when we're brought in early to sort of think through the strategy, not least because I think the problem with the world today is that any strategy you deploy against any stakeholder is immediately visible to a lot of other stakeholder groups as well. So there really is a need for a coordinated approach, when you're dealing with regulators, when you're dealing with, customers and employees and so on, and that everyone's hearing a sort of consistent message from the parties involved. So I think, I'd say our role is twofold. I think on the one hand, we can be quite helpful in sort of helping to understand where perceptions are. I think Stuart spoke about this in relation to the regulatory environment, but really understanding what might be on the minds of regulators, but not just regulators, right? What might be on the minds of other parties involved. And as a result, what might be the messages that could, help to move the needle in one direction or another, or to help, the position, the transaction to be viewed as neutral to positive rather than being against or negatively perceived. And then obviously the other side of it is really working through a strategy that takes into account different stakeholders, timing of how they're going to be notified, through which channels and so on. But again, working very much in close coordination with the legal advisors. So we do this in a lot of situations, and it definitely can be a very strong partnership, when we work well together. And sorry, your other question was on leak strategies and
That's right.
leaks. I think this is really critical, and it's usually one of the first things that we end up having to come in on. Very often we come up with a plan, and there's a plan for how we're going to communicate to different stakeholder groups. Not least because there are also sort of deadlines and key milestones according to which we need to do this. Unfortunately, particularly given the number of people involved in many of these situations, as well as how information flows, the information does get out into the market quite early. And nowadays we find that media, for example, get wind of situations pretty quickly from rumors and so on. And so there really needs to be a strategy in place to handle leaks. And the biggest risk with that is really just losing control of the narrative, because all of a sudden you're not in control of the timeline and how you're planning to communicate with different stakeholders, and that is sort of taken out of your hands to a degree. So I think really for us the key is, how do you manage that? Is there a way to quell rumors in an early stage, and sort of encourage people not to be spreading misinformation? And if that cannot be done, then what are the strategies to try and grip the situation a little bit more quickly, and sometimes even having to sort of think about timing of plans and so on based on what information is out there.
I would just add on top of that, in terms of activism, having what we call a break the glass plan for when an activist comes in is very similar in terms of preparing that leak strategy, so that the company, when an activist comes along and perhaps does something publicly right from the beginning, oftentimes, as I mentioned before, there's a private dialogue, and then it gets to perhaps a leak in the media, public dialogue from there. But knowing when for the company to really have that plan in place of how they're going to gather, how they're going to assess the situation, what they're going to say in the first few hours after that activist has come out there and done something publicly is critical, because oftentimes the activist will have the first mover advantage in these situations. But if the company can respond in a timely manner in that same news cycle, rationally and calmly, and still demonstrate that they're in control, that's important.
Thanks, Sunita. And Charlie, I'm going to stick with you. I'm going to, since we are talking about activism, and so what are some common mistakes that companies make when defending against an activism case? And, what kind of strategies can companies employ to manage it?
Yeah, I think, well, first and foremost, it's important that the company speak with one voice, and that's across management, across the board, across all advisors. It's important that the messaging is really coordinated, and there, you don't have a director, for instance, who thinks that they can be the diplomat, they can solve this, and sort of going off on their own to speak to the activist, an investor, member of the media, whatever it may be. The messaging all has to be closely coordinated. I think one of the other mistakes that companies make, particularly CEOs, is that they take the activist involvement personally, and they feel like they need to fight back as hard as possible from day one. And that's exactly what the activist is banking on. They want to draw the company out into that public arena, and then they can have it out, right? And it's really important that the company assess the situation, stay measured, and as I said before, they're not going to win the battle on day one, but they could very well lose it by going out and saying something ridiculous like company's not for sale. Like, well, it's a public company, it's for sale every day. Or, just being completely dismissive of an activist thesis or ideas. They need to also have a very good sense for what their other investors think. So it really is an investor relations exercise, but elevated by a huge magnitude. So they need to really understand where all of their key investors stand and if they might be receptive to that theory that the activist is putting forward. But they need to have that ongoing dialogue and that well of trust with their big investors so they know that they can then speak to them and say, what are your thoughts here? We are the responsible stewards of your capital, and we want to do what's best for shareholders. So we value your input, and we want to hear what you have to say about the investor's idea, the activist's idea.
Thank you, Charlie. I think as we are coming close to the hour, I'm going to see whether there's any questions from the floor. Okay, maybe one for Stuart. Given the rising intervention rates and more transactions being blocked or requiring remedies, what strategies could companies employ to navigate the current landscape?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I think the first thing is actually to have a bit of perspective, because across almost every kind of, jurisdiction, there's a lot of attention on those deals that get blocked. But these are often an extremely small proportion overall. I mean, if I look at kind of my home territory here in the UK, which is where the CMA is viewed as possibly kind of the most aggressive antitrust authority globally, they will kind of review between sort of 600 and 700 kind of mergers each year, and the number that get blocked is normally no more than either 5, so 5 or 6. So I think the first thing is as well as seeing the headlines about deals being blocked, look at how extensive the enforcement rate is in practice. Secondly, then really to look at, even if you don't want to talk publicly about remedies to address concerns, start that planning kind of early on. Think about, the approach that you might take in different jurisdictions. Think about the best time to engage on remedies, so that you are best prepared for the point at which you might get into that discussion.
Thanks, Stuart. Here's another one. In today's digital age, how important are digital platforms when it comes to complex cross-border transactions? Maybe I'll ask Sunita to take that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I'm sure Stuart and Charlie will have more specific comments in relation to, regulation and activism. But I think we use digital tools, quite a bit now in these types of situations. I think there are two things that are really, really important. I mean, getting our messages out there is key. But what that message looks like and how you tailor it and make it easily digestible for different audiences is even more important. People are all short of time. They all want information quickly. And depending on sort of the different stakeholders that you're dealing with, getting the information to them through the right channels and the right format is actually critical to raising awareness and developing an understanding of what's happening in a transaction. And I think that, we tend to start with something like a deal microsite, which literally is a repository of information on what's happening, the transaction, the rationale, where you can find answers to questions and so on. And the other interesting thing with this is it's a very effective way to go directly to stakeholders. The other thing that we do very effectively now is also put paid search behind that. So if people are looking for information on the transaction and they search on Google, basically, they can be directed straight to the website, which again ensures that people who are looking for the information on the issue or on the transaction are first directed to the company's source of information rather than other sources like the media, which may be reporting on the issue in a slightly, from a different lens. But I just want to see if Stuart and Charlie have anything to add to that.
I mean, I'll just mention one thing in terms of how kind of antitrust authorities are kind of sort of using this. They're not in general the most sophisticated sort of communicators online, but what increasingly they're putting money into is through their sort of data analytics sort of units to analyze huge numbers of companies' internal documents to look for relevant information and really going through millions, literally millions of documents to be able to kind of sort of gather evidence. I think certainly that is a significant development that we're seeing sort of enforcers use.
Yeah, I would just follow up and perhaps parrot a bit of what Sunitha said in terms of communicating to the range of stakeholders, especially in a deal, in an activist situation. Ultimately, if you're looking for shareholder approval, the shareholders will decide, but the wider stakeholder universe of employees, regulators, customers, communities in which the companies operate are all very important, and leveraging digital channels to reach all of those stakeholders through a variety of different channels is really imperative nowadays.
Thanks. Let me see if there doesn't seem that there are many any further questions from the audience. Perhaps I'll end with just one more, and this is for Charlie. What would you advise companies who are finding themselves in a contested situation for the first time?
I think it sort of comes down to three things. It's one, be sure that they know their story, control their own investor narrative, and know that that is well understood out there in the marketplace. To know their shareholders and know the views of their shareholders and really understand who the decision makers are at each of those institutions. And if there's a significant retail population, find ways of communicating with that retail population digitally or otherwise. And the third is to know the team that they're going to work with in an activist situation. A lot of advisors like ourselves are perfectly experienced in parachuting in at the 11th hour when an activist has shown up. But these relationships work best when the company knows their advisor team well, and the advisor team really understands the company and its story and its relationships with its shareholders and wider stakeholders.
Thank you, Charlie. And I think this just leaves me with the pleasure of thanking our speakers today, Sunitha, Stuart, Charlie. On behalf of the World Law Group, thank you so much for spending your precious time with us and sharing your thoughts. I think it's been a very fruitful hour. And so can everyone please join me in a round of virtual applause? Thank you for the Brunswick team. Thank you.